There we go. That'll work. Good. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Oh, we lost one already. Okay. Well, I hope everyone can hear me all right. Let me, whoops, get this going here. Oh, she's back. Whoops, not now. Not now. Not now. Admit. There we go. There we go. All right. Yeah, let me get this going here. Okay, folks. Well, today is a new topic. So I might have explained this on Tuesday to those of you who came just for the Q&A. That today's topic is wholly separate from what was on the midterm quiz. Okay, so this is a new concept now that's going to start culminating what we've been looking at for the first few sections of this class. If you look back in general, it's easy to do in the modules section. You can sort of see how the cinematography 1 class starts to come together after a few weeks in a normal circumstance. In your case, it's coming together pretty quickly. But in the beginning of the semester, we ask a very basic question. What is cinematography? What are these people doing? Okay. How is it different from simply operating a camera, going into a random situation, pointing your camera at something and recording the action? What's the difference? What's going on? So we start dissecting that from the point of view of some modern contemporary role models, some working cinematographers, take a look at what they're doing, what their body work looks like, and then we look at the support system that's in place for a cinematographer on something like a feature film or a television show. And we start looking at the roles of different individuals within the camera department on a contract structured professional project, like a TV series, let's say. And from there, we start thinking about, okay, we know basically what's going on. We know the people that are involved. We understand they have a support system in place of other individuals doing specific jobs within the context of a professional project. What kind of tools are they using? So then we look at your camera systems and your choices. We look at cameras themselves. We look at ways of rendering images. We look at how to record those images, the media that we use, the presentation that we select. And then from there, we start thinking about the smaller component parts of a working system, the camera being at the center of that ecosystem, the brain, if you will, the capture device, the thing that renders the image. And we look at the support systems in place for the camera. So we look at lenses. We talk about the basic mechanical function of a lens. The idea that it's a projection system that allows light to strike the image sensor. The image sensor is then recording data that's processed by the camera's processor, and that becomes the basis for our image file, for our digital image file. So we look at lenses, and then we look at things that we can use in conjunction with lenses, filters for strictly creative choices, and for ways now to affect the very basic image file itself as a raw data entity. And then we consider that data entity more as an image. And then we start thinking about how we can affect things mechanically with that image to change the way that it renders or the way it appeals to the audience. So filters is a really obvious way to start examining that notion. Lighting is another way to explore the notion of manipulating the image file beyond mere data and more in an aesthetic purpose. And we're going to look at that in another few sections. But for now, we stopped that conversation prior to the midterm quiz with the discussion of filters. So it was all kind of a mechanical artifact discussion. And then we stop when we have the midterm. So I'm kind of bringing you up to a point now after the midterm, after we get through those basic fundamental discussions. Now we're going to start drilling a little deeper. So we're going to start thinking about the implications of some of those mechanical choices that we've made, right? And the first thing to do, which is a fairly broad conversation, and it can be sometimes a little daunting for those who are not versed in basic photographic principles. If you have never taken a photography course before, for instance, or if you're not particularly inclined to take pictures beyond the casual snaps you might create with your cell phone. The concept of exposure can be a little esoteric to some people. And so I want to have sort of, again, another sort of introductory conversation with you today about what exposure sort of is from a very fundamental point of view, okay? I have a couple of different ways that I can present the information. I have my keynote presentation, which is part of a 3-hour lecture under normal circumstances, which has been pre-recorded and is on web courses for you. But I think what I'm going to do is take one of the documents from your downloadable PDFs page in section 1.9. There's 2 documents on exposure. They're both pretty good. One of them was created by me and a colleague at another institution, and it's a very rudimentary discussion about exposure and what it's composed of and what the notions of exposure are. I'm going to look at that document with you. We'll do that together here. And then there's a little bit broader document. It's a studio binder document, which I like a lot because it has a lot of the same concepts that I describe in my own PDF document, and expands on those a little bit and sort of bridges the gap between the PDF document that I've created for you and the lecture and the full recorded video with all of the concepts from the keynote presentation. Um, so those are two pretty good readings resources for you here in section 1.9. And then there is a chapter on exposure in one of the textbooks that I provided for you on your bookshelf, which is the Blaine Brown third edition Cinematography Theory and Practice. And that chapter is called Exposure. The chapters aren't numbered, unfortunately, in this volume, so you have to go by the title. So look for the chapter titled Exposure, and that's your reading assignment for this section 1.9. Okay, and you can download that, or you can simply open it here in web courses and read it right through the LMS. Okay, so that's up to you. So that's where we're at. So again, today's discussion is now going to move beyond what was covered on the midterm. So this will be moving forward, the first conversation we're going to have now between now and the end of the summer session, which will help sort of put together all of the, all the concepts from sections 1.7 and start showing you the implications of choices that you're going to make, which will affect aesthetically the images that you'll create. Okay, so let's talk about exposure. Let me go to the PDF, I think, or well, hold on. Let's go. First, we'll go here. So exposure, because I ask a very basic question in my keynote presentation. What is it? What are we talking about? Okay, so if you haven't thought about this conversation before, you're going to ask the question, well, what are you talking about? And I'm referring to a very basic condition, the way you're going to render your image. And you can think about it in terms of brightness if you want. Is the image too bright? Is the image too dark? Sometimes you might think of it in terms of contrast and possibly in terms of color, saturation, and variety of color. Exposure is encompassing a lot of those ideas, okay? Brightness and darkness, contrast, color saturation, and depth, or the rendering accuracy of your colors. And then we can take other steps beyond those three basic principles, and we can look at it in a little bit deeper way. So think about it in terms of your camera. It's a set of adjustments that you're going to make with your device. So, if you've got whatever you're working with, so here's a GH5 basically. How are you adjusting this camera? Are you letting the camera make these choices for you? You shouldn't be. If you're in a creative capacity in a filmmaking environment, you don't want devices making creative choices for you. So we need to understand exposure so that we can adjust this device in a way which will give us accurate rendering of our colors, our saturation, our contrast, and our brightness. And then there will be other sort of peripheral benefits to the adjustments we make to this camera. Those are conversations we'll have in another week, let's say on depth of field, for instance. What happens when you set a lens to a certain aperture size? It's not just how much light is passing to the lens. There are other principles that will happen as a result of those decisions. But the initial conversation now is, how do I set this thing so I get a nice looking image that represents my creative choices, not the random or disassociated creative choices of a mechanical device specifically. Okay. And those basic adjustments that we can make to our device are going to come in three sort of categories. Initially, as I open the conversation, there's going to be three principles that I want you to be familiar with. And then I'm going to show you, we can expand that conversation to a couple more areas that will help sort of broaden the conversation. The three areas or the three concepts that I want to talk to you about are the sensitivity of your camera. We refer to that as the ISO of your camera. We're going to talk about the control of light through your lens in the terms of the aperture selection that you can make. That's the physical diaphragm that's inside the lens. So remember, in a mechanical manual system, okay, we've got an iris that we can control. And as we do so, we change the size of a diaphragm, which corresponds mathematically to what we call an f-stop or an f number. And it's merely referring to how we control the flow of light coming through this lens. Okay, and it's done manually on a ring we call an f-stop ring or an aperture control ring on a cinema lens. This happens to be a Meika 25 millimeter, which is native to the GH5 I have sitting right next to me. We have manual control over focus, and we have manual control over that aperture size or that diaphragm size, which then corresponds to one aspect of the brightening and darkening of the image, the exposure control that I'm talking about. Okay. So these are the very fundamental beginnings of this conversation. The conversation will evolve over the next few sections. And obviously, I'm open to your questions, your concerns, or whatever involving these concepts moving forward. Each week we'll kind of bite off a little bit more of these ideas, and hopefully by the end of the summer session, by the end of the semester, you'll have a basic sense of what all these parts are doing in combination to affect your images. Okay. The final concept in the what we call the exposure triangle, which is kind of illustrated here, is shutter speed. And that's really all that really is referring to is the duration of time that your sensor, okay, inside your camera, you're going to have an image sensor, which is going to be, connected to your image processor. I don't know if you can see it in there. I'm trying to catch a little of my key light. This is a Micro Four Thirds sensor, so it's kind of small, but you can sort of see it, the green glass surface in there. The duration that that sensor is exposed to light and energized. Okay, so that's the other kind of critical part of this process. The processor inside, it's always in there. The sensor is always in there, right? And I can take the lens off this camera right now and expose it to light. That doesn't mean anything's happening. Part of this process is when we engage the shutter mechanism, when we push the button to start recording, that sensor then becomes energized through your power source. And in this case, it's the battery that is inside the camera. When the sensor is energized, in that moment, in the duration of that moment, that's when the light coming through the lens becomes critical. How much of it's striking the sensor, in what way, that contributes to the creation of your image, right? So the shutter speed or the duration that that sensor is energized or exposed to light, in the case of a film camera, that is the notion of shutter speed. Okay. And that has some implications as well. So three fundamental areas that start this conversation on exposure: shutter speed, sensitivity of your sensor, and then the control of your iris or aperture inside your lens. Okay. And then beyond that, I can add filtration again as an aspect of exposure control. And we can talk about an aspect of the frames per second, the volume of material, whether you're shooting in slow motion, fast motion, or normal motion, that can have some effect on exposure control as well. Okay. So at this point, I'm going to move over to this document. This is what the title or facing page will look like when you open that PDF, Understanding Exposure in the Exposure Triangle. Okay. I'm going to switch to the document now. And I just want to no, I don't want to organize the pages. Please don't. Thank you. Okay. We'll open the conversation with the idea again, what is exposure? So in this document, we're defining exposure as the relative brightness of the tonal values present in your image. Okay. Digital sensors. We talked about this a little bit a couple sections ago. When we talked about the actual sensor and the recording media, we talked about how the sensor has pixels, it has photosites, microscopic in nature. They correspond to the resolution of your images, 1920 by 1080, for instance, if we're talking about full HD. And these photosites, or these buckets, if you will, I think Blaine Brown calls them buckets as well, have in a basic digital imaging system like maybe not the GH5, this is fairly sophisticated, but let's say your Canon 5D, for instance. We refer to that as an 8-bit rendering system, okay? Um, and that really is referring to these buckets, these pixel sites on the sensor itself. How much data can they record? How many variations can they record? um, how much complexity of the image file is created in a system that has 8 bits of data rendering. And it's basically a value system from 0 to 255 discrete pieces of information. Okay. When these buckets fill up with the digital information, any information that is brought into the sensor beyond what those pixel sites can hold in terms of their rendering ability is what we call overexposure. That data is not used; it's wasted or lost in an image file. Conversely, if we don't fill these buckets up with enough information, we associate that condition with underexposure, with images that are very dark and maybe have a lot of noise incorporated in them because there wasn't enough light information recorded on the sensor to fill up those little photo sites, right? With 0 to 255 discrete values. Okay. So in a nutshell, that's what's happening digitally when we talk about exposure. Okay, film works very similar. It's more of a photochemical relationship, but it still involves silver grains and their exposure to light and how many grains are present in a piece of negative recording film. Um, and underexposure means enough of those silver grains weren't exposed to light to be converted to salts when they're developed, therefore leaving lots of empty information space in a color negative, for instance, which we would associate when projected as grain, okay, or the absence of detail in the image, right? Whether you're talking about film or whether you're talking about digital, it's basically the same relationship. It's uh, is the image too bright? Is the image too dark? It relates to how much light is coming in. The quantity of light affects the image sensor in the processor, filling up the photo sites with discrete values that can be converted by the processor into image information. Is that information too dark? Is it too bright? How do we control it? How do we affect the way it looks tonally to our audience? We can refer to these values as an exposure triangle. They interrelate. So it's kind of like a three-way seesaw, if you can think about it that way, a teeter-totter. The opening in your lens has a series of settings that can be made. They affect how much light can hit your sensor. Shutter speed, the amount of time that the sensor is exposed to light, can affect the brightness and darkness of the image. And those two values alone can act as a balancing act. But then we also incorporate the sensitivity of that sensor. And that sort of tempers the relationship between shutter speed and aperture. So we can put ISO at one focus of a triangle, for instance, and think about it sometimes as an isolated value against the other two, right? So aperture and shutter speed are trying to balance one another out. How much time do we let the sensor see the light? How much light do we let the sensor see? And that becomes an equation, right? And then the sensitivity of the sensor will tell us, um, you know, the relationship of that sort of balancing act, right? Is it a small teeter totter or a big teeter totter? Is it a lot of light because the sensor is insensitive to the information, or is it a very little amount of light that has to balance between aperture and shutter because the sensor is very sensitive and doesn't need a lot of light to create an image? Okay, so those are the values of the exposure triangle. Each one of them can be manipulated, and while it sounds complex, I want to show you how certain aspects of our filming can sort of dictate how we can lock in these values So we don't have to allow them to slide up and down a scale and create chaos with our choices and how much confusion is created. And we can lock values in and isolate the most, I think the most fundamental and valuable aspect of exposure, your aperture control, the easiest to access and the one with the most obvious mechanical relationship. We can isolate that choice alone by locking other values like ISO and shutter speed into predetermined settings that we need specifically, for instance, for recording sound. Okay. If we start looking at the components of the exposure triangle, if we start with aperture, right? We're talking about this diaphragm inside the lens. How big is it? Mechanically and mathematically speaking, how much light is passing through that lens? And then giving it a numerical value. And the numerical value is there for comparative reference, right? So if you look at in this illustration, for instance, this basic scale of aperture values, okay, they start at f2 over here, and they start going up in decimal equivalent, right? Each time the diaphragm gets a little bit smaller, the number gets a little bit bigger, right? Which seems like the opposite. If you have a small opening for light to pass through your lens, you would think that that would correspond to a small number. Well, it kind of does if you think about these numerical values not as whole numbers, but as fractions. Okay, so if you think of f2 as a mathematical relationship between the focal length of the elements inside your lens and the measurement, the physical measurement of the diaphragm's diameter, when you do the calculation, you get a number something like f2, right? Now, if you think of this as your base solution, your widest point possible on your lens, and I think that's fairly consistent with this little makeup here. It says 2.2, I think, is the maximum diaphragm opening. So it's a decimal f2.2, f2 plus 2/10, the t-stop equivalent. All the glass elements inside this add a little extra to the t value, making it a little bit more than f2 t2.2, but we'll call that our base aperture value. That's the widest opening we can achieve. That's the most amount of light we can let through the lens, right? If we close that diaphragm down from 2 to 2.8, right? If we look at my witness mark here, which is here, this little hash mark, if we close it down to a 2.8 from a 2, right? And then we look at the relationship comparison between the size of the opening here. If we could compare the area of this opening and the area of that opening, you would find that this is allowing exactly half as much light to pass through the lens as it did when it was wide open at f2. Okay, so if you can think of these numbers with a very basic relationship, this size at a 2.8 is allowing half as much light into the lens as f2. Okay, that's the relationship. If we keep going down the scale, you'll see f4, right? This opening here, if you could measure the area of that opening and compare it to the area of this opening, you'd see that it was half the size again, right? So each time we're going down the scale to smaller and smaller aperture sizes, we are decreasing the amount of light that's passing through the lens by roughly 50%. Okay, that relationship, half and half again and half again, is what we call a stop. Okay, one f-stop specifically in relationships. So f2 to f2.8 is one f-stop smaller, right, in aperture size, or one f-stop less light is passing through your lens. Okay, these numbers are called f-stops, and we refer to their relationships one to the next in terms of f-stops, right? So 2.8 is half as much light as a 2, one f-stop darker. 4 is half as much light again from 2.8, a quarter the amount of light of f2. Okay, that's why I say think of these numbers as fractions, and it starts to make a little more sense, right? Each time you close this diaphragm a little bit more, you're taking half the light away again and again and again. The net effect of closing this aperture down like that is less light passes through the lens, and therefore the image gets rendered darker and darker on the image sensor. This is the basic way that we're controlling exposure if the other values in our triangle, ISO and shutter speed, can be locked into specific settings. And I'm going to show you how that's done. Okay. The shutter is, like I said, the duration of time that your sensor is energized and is recording the light value, striking it through that's coming through the lens. Okay. Now, when we record video and we're recording projects for school, videos for the web, programs for television, movies for theater, okay, we're recording people doing things, and most of the time it's people talking to each other, right? In the very most rudimentary sense, we're recording videos of what people do, and people quite often talk to each other. So recording dialogue is a specific condition in cinematography where we have to lock values in our exposure triangle in order to make the audio portion of what we're doing make sense to the images, right? For instance, you have to lock in your shutter speed and your consequently a shutter angle, which is sort of a cinematography 2 concept, but for a specific frame rate, which I mentioned is a sort of a peripheral condition to the exposure triangle. Frame rate, how many frames per second are we recording? We know that in order for our videos to make sense in audio terms, we have to record at 24 frames per second. Okay. When we record images at 24 frames per second, the audio that we record to accompany the images makes sense in terms of what we call the lip flap, right? So if I'm talking to you and I'm recording a video and my lips don't seem to match the words that you hear on the soundtrack, then somehow the picture may be out of sync with the audio. There is technically a frame rate for audio. I don't want to get into it, but there technically is, and that frame rate can be out of sync with the visual frame rate the camera's recording. Okay, but at 24 frames per second, the audio and the visual components of the image make sense, and that frame rate corresponds to a specific shutter duration. Okay, so if we want to lock this value in, we can say we're going to lock this value in at 24 frames per second, which happens to correspond to a speed value of 1/48th of a second. Okay, in other words, it's double the frame rate. So 24 frames per second, the resulting shutter speed, if you needed to know it, would be 1/48th of a second. Okay, we can lock that value in just saying we're recording dialogue, and we don't have to worry about the shutter value anymore and its variable possibilities. Okay, just lock it in at 24p. Okay, ISO can work the same way. Okay, ISO is nothing more than the sensitivity of your recording sensor. Okay, so in other words, the manufacturer, this is a GH5 from Panasonic or Lumix, right? So Lumix designs this camera and this sensor inside to have a certain effective sensitivity, right? It can seem like an esoteric relationship, but it has to do with how this sensor was manufactured and how much base light you need just for this camera to be able to create images that are pleasing to the eye, not too bright, not too dark, proper color rendition, and so forth. If you look in your manufacturer's operator's manual for a camera like this, you'll find that there is a recommended ISO. there's a sensitivity that you can set on this camera. If you access the ISO button on the controls here, turn it into my key light, you can see there's an ISO button here. I can tell this sensor to demonstrate a sensitivity along a range of electronic or numeric values, okay? And if I select that here, when we talk about ISO, there's a series of numerical values that compare to and describe to you in relative terms the sensitivity of your sensor. This camera has a native ISO, it's called. It has a recommended sensitivity setting that you adjust in the camera per the manufacturer's specs, and that happens to be on this Panasonic GH5 ISO 800, which is right here on this scale of numbers. Okay, this scale of numbers is, comparatively speaking, relative to one another, just like f-stops are relative to one another in terms of the size of the diameter of your aperture, right? So if I have a base manufacturer's recommended ISO setting of 800 for my Panasonic GH5, I notice that I can reassign the sensitivity of that chip. In other words, I can tell the chip, take more energy from the power source, take less energy from the power source. And when you do that, when you take less energy from the power source, you create a desensitized state on the sensor, which, if the sensor is desensitized, will require an abundance of light to create the same image that it would if I'd left the value at the recommended manufacturer setting of 800. So if I were to go ISO 400 from ISO 800, okay, I'm basically telling the sensor, you don't need to wait for this much energy. You can take half as much energy, but when you do so, half as much energy requires twice as much light to make the same well-balanced image that you would create at ISO 800. Okay, but I can do this for very specific reasons. Okay, if I go to the beach to take video, there's a lot of light at the beach. There's more light than I'm ever going to need to create well-balanced, well-exposed images. Okay, if I go to the beach and I tell the camera to assume its native ISO of 800, I might find that I'm constantly selecting really, really small aperture sizes for my lenses in order to block a lot of the unnecessary light from my exposure so that my image doesn't become too bright. Well, there's a problem that happens at really, really small apertures, which we'll talk about in a week or so, which is I can't control my depth of focus. I can't have things out of focus if I want them to be. Everything's going to be sharp and in focus, kind of like the images you're going to create with a cell phone. And I don't want that sort of compositional problem with my images, because if I'm directing the audience's eye, sometimes I want things in the frame to be out of focus and things that I prefer to be in focus so the audience knows what they're supposed to be thinking about or what my message is to them. So there's problems with having too much sensitivity at the beach when there's too much light. So I can tell my sensor, look, if you only take half of the energy needed to create an image, then I have to have twice as much light. If I'm already in a situation where I already have twice as much light as I need, I might want to make my sensor half as sensitive, okay? The opposite is also true. If I'm shooting downtown Orlando at night, let's say, and I want to take pictures of the skyline with LEDs and the colors and everything, there's not a lot of light going on at night downtown Orlando. Certainly not as much available light as there would be during the day. If that's the case, then the sensitivity of my chip at its native 800 may not be sensitive enough to create well-balanced images in a deficit of light or for less than available light, okay? So I might want to make my sensor more sensitive by giving more energy to the capture device. So I might say, instead of 800 ISO, I'm going to go to 1600 ISO, and I'm going to make the sensor twice as sensitive because there's half as much light at night as there might be during the day. Hopefully that makes sense. You can play with the sensitivity values of your sensor based on how much available light you have or how much light you're going to supplement with fixtures, for instance. But our base place to start is always going to be our native ISO. What does the manufacturer recommend in an average situation? What sensitivity does it recommend you set your camera for? And in the case of the Panasonic, it's 800 ISO. If that's the case, if the manufacturer says in the variety of situations that you're going to shoot, 800 ISO is going to perform very well and give you options for lightening and darkening your image to taste and have those results be appealing, set that value and lock it in on your camera. Okay. If Panasonic says the camera performs best at ISO 800, lock it in. Now you don't use it as a variable anymore. You lock it in as a value. You've locked in your shutter speed as a value by saying, I'm going to record dialogue at 24 frames per second. So the audio and the picture match up nicely. Now I've locked in two values in the exposure triangle that I don't have to think about anymore. And the only remaining value that will come into play is your aperture. How much light are you letting in through the lens? Is it making the image too bright or too dark? Okay. And by locking in these two values, ISO and shutter speed, this becomes your only remaining responsibility. Okay. And then it becomes a very easy matter. If you look at either your camera's onboard LCD screen, or maybe you have a separate external monitor, something a little bit larger, you look at that image. If it's too dark, open up your iris. If it's too bright, close your iris down. And you've controlled exposure in that regard in the most fundamental way. Okay. And that's in essence the exposure triangle, and how we're controlling these settings manually. Um, Ultimately, these choices are going to have something to do with the broad appeal of your images to your audience. Okay. Um, so, quick recap: ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. Three basic fundamental controls you can execute with your camera to control the brightness and darkness of your image. Okay. Each setting in its particular relationship, whether it's aperture sizes or ISO settings, and also in the case shutter speeds. We won't get into that too deeply here. Every time you move up and down that scale, you jump from one value to the next. You're either reducing the amount of exposure by 1/2 or doubling the amount of exposure by 2. Okay. So if I go back really quickly to page, what was it? 4, I think. 5. No, 4. I was right the first time. Each time I close my aperture down, I'm letting half as much light in. The opposite is double the result, right? So if I start at f4, right, and I open the lens to a 2.8, I'm now allowing twice as much light into the lens as I was at f4, right? If I go from 2.8 to 4, it's half. If I go from a small number to a larger number, it's half. If I go from a larger number to a smaller number, it's twice as much. Okay. So it depends on whether you're moving to the right or to the left on any one of these scales. So this is apertures. Shutter speeds kind of works the same way. 1/48 is your 24p setting. I can go to 90-degree shutter angle, which is 1/96. Okay. Or I can go to 270-degree opening, a really wide opening, 1/32. You can see how the resulting shutter speed changes in relationship. Okay. This is a cinematography 2 concept. I don't encourage you to delve too deeply in this if you're new to these concepts. Just understand at this point in time, shutter speed corresponds to frame rate. 24 frames per second is our preferred frame rate for recording audio, and that has a correlating shutter speed of 1/48 of a second. That's all you got to know for cinematography 1. Okay, the other relationships here of shutter angle are more specific to film camera control and to more complex concepts of exposure control with digital cinema cameras that you might do with advanced conditions that you're shooting under. We won't worry about that in cinematography one. Okay. But again, look at your ISO relationships. Whoops, went the wrong way. ISO relationships, native ISO. In the case of the Panasonic, 800 is the native ISO. You have a range of ISOs all the way from 100, very unsensitive, 3200, very sensitive, image sensor power condition, if you will. Okay. 3200 ISO is a very sensitive condition for your sensor to be in. 800 being the native, 400 being half as sensitive, 200 being half as sensitive again. 800 being the native, 1600 being twice as sensitive, 3200 being twice again as sensitive as 1600. Okay. So if you move to the left, it's twice as much. Move to the right, it's half as much. Okay. Whether it's f-stops, shutter speeds, or apertures, it's all the same relationship. And we call each of those relationships a stop relationship. ISO 800, ISO 400. ISO 400 is one stop less sensitive than ISO 800. ISO 1600 is twice as sensitive as ISO 800. Okay. This twice as much, half as much relationship is the same as half as much, twice as much in terms of aperture sizes. It's calibrated, it's correlated, it's the same relationship. One f stop or half as much, twice as much or half as much. Okay. One f stop too bright, one f stop too dark. Okay. Now, let's make it a little more complicated. Okay. How so? Frame rate. I talked to you about how frame rate can change. Unless you want to record slow motion, there's not going to be any reason for you to change your frame rate from 24p. Okay. Because, like I said, only at 24p or 30p for television, technically, your audio and your visual match up, they line up, they don't look like they're out of sync. Okay. If you record an image for slow motion, your frame rate's going to be considerably more than 24p. If you want really slow motion to accentuate somebody running down a hallway, for instance, you might shoot at 96 frames per second. But when you do that, you can't be recording audio of critical dialogue because the image won't match what you hear. Okay. So there'll be a problem. So you're going to reserve high frame rates for action and things where the dialogue is not critical to the image, right? Or when people aren't saying anything, they're just doing something, running down a hallway, jumping off a building, crashing a car, skydiving, jumping out of an airplane, whatever, jumping something with a motorcycle. Okay. If you want to extend those moments with slow motion, then the audio is taking a back seat to the visual, which is in those moments considered more important. The slow motion means something to the story. Okay. But when you're recording dialogue, it's got to be 24p. Okay. So we can leave frame rate alone then in that regard and just say, okay, we know there's more things going on, but for our purposes right now, we're recording audio in a very basic situation. It's 24p. That's it. Okay. Filters, on the other hand, can help you with this problem, specifically with your aperture control. Okay. Because there's going to be times when, like I said, if you're at the beach and you're using really small aperture sizes because there's so much light going on, really small aperture sizes don't allow you to create selective focus between foreground and background. Everything seems to be sharp because a small aperture size, kind of like when you squint your eyes, right? Everything becomes clear, right? And foreground and background, everything is clear. If you do that, though, your audience may have trouble differentiating objects in the background from objects in the foreground, and they'll lose track of what they're supposed to be looking at within an image frame. Okay. So in order to control what your audience is looking at, we might want to throw the background out of focus. Well, you can't do that with a really small aperture size. Okay. And if there's a lot of light coming through the lens and that sensor's getting hit by a whole bunch of light, right? You can lower your ISO. Sometimes you can only lower it so much, and there's so much light, you're still having small aperture selections as a result. You might want to do something, and I sort of alluded to this when we talked about filters. Put sunglasses on your sensor, right? Just like you put sunglasses on your eyes when you go to the beach, right? If you do that, you can select wider apertures as a result of putting sunglasses over your lens. And the wider apertures will allow you to start creating a difference in focus between foreground and background. We call that depth of field. I'll talk to you about that next week. Okay. But that's a direct relationship to the aperture in your lens. So if the only setting that you're really left responsible for is your aperture control, and you're dealing with just the aperture control size and the amount of light coming through the lens, if you want to limit those choices in aperture for some reason, then you got to use some other control of the amount of light coming through the lens. In that case, neutral density filters become a very viable option for you in terms of controlling how bright or how dark your image is. Okay. So neutral density filters working in conjunction with aperture, even though the shutter value and the ISO values are locked in, becomes a very effective way of helping you manage brightness and darkness of your image while using specific apertures. If I know, for instance, that at an ISO 2 or f-stop of 2 or 2.8, I can throw my background radically out of focus, then picking f-stops way down here is not going to help me with the results that I can achieve over here, right? So I would add neutral density filters to prevent this required setting from happening, right? If 2.8 is where I want to be on my lens, but I've got so much light on the beach that I have to set my lens to an f8 to balance the image, or an f11, if I count the jumps from 11 to my desired 2.8, let's see what we get. 1, 2, 3, 4 jumps, right? If I need to be here on a raw, on a bare lens at the beach, right, to prevent too much light from exposing my image, but I want to be down here at a 2.8 so I can throw the background out of focus and keep the foreground sharp, then I have to 1, 2, 3, 4. I have to be able to open my lens 1, 2, 3, 4 f-stops, 4 jumps. But if I do that, every time I do that, how much light am I letting through the lens? 1, 2, 3, 4. Twice as much again, twice as much again, twice as much again, right? 4 f-stops. Well, it just so happens that there are neutral density filters that are 4-stop reduction filters. Okay. They're called ND 1.2 or ND 1/16 or ND 4X. Okay. They all refer to basically the same filter, which is a really dark pair of sunglasses, 4 f-stops worth of dark, so that I can take my unaided lens at an 11, throw that 4-stop neutral density filter on the lens, and now open that iris 1, 2, 3, 4 f-stops and set the iris now at a 2.8 with a 4-stop neutral density filter in place and balance my exposure that way. Okay. That becomes a really important tool for controlling the amount of light that's available when you got more light than you need. Okay. You don't need neutral density filters at night because you're already dealing with a really low amount of light to begin with. And you may or may not need neutral density filters shooting on interiors. Sometimes day interior, if you're shooting in a really bright environment with a lot of windows, for instance, letting daylight in through the windows into the room you're shooting at, you might want to use an ND filter to get a really wide aperture on your lens. But most of the time, the only time you need ND filters is when you're shooting outside during the day. Okay. And then that becomes a really useful tool for controlling the amount of light so that you can use specific apertures for their depth of field values rather than simply their light control characteristic. Okay. That's in a nutshell exposure control in terms of manual camera settings and filtration as an added control benefit. Okay, that's basically it in a nutshell. Here's your neutral density filter illustrated here. You can see how bright the background would be under normal circumstances and how well balanced the environment can look through the filter at a given f-stop. Okay. With your FC1000 kits, I've asked that UCF buy you guys variable neutral density filters. So they act like uh, radiant control. So you put the filter on the front of your lens, and as you turn it, you'll see the image get brighter or darker, kind of like if you were changing the aperture value, but it allows you to keep the aperture value the same, turn the filter, and the filter gets darker or brighter depending on which way you turn it. Okay, because there's two opposing filter values working inside, creating an impairment for light or not. A variable neutral density filter is a really strong and valuable tool for you, especially in the beginning, to help control exposure on a camera like an FC1000. Okay. Um, Frame rates, as you can see here, have a relationship. They are twice as much, half as much if you look at the right values. Okay. But like I said, this is more of a cinematography 2 concept. So I don't want to dwell too much on this. Just understand that 1/48. So this is highlighted in gray. You see here 24 frames per second. That's your critical dialogue frame rate, right? 30 is for television, and television broadcast has a slightly different shutter speed going on because of the way video is assembled for broadcast and the way it's uh, uplinked from satellites to affiliates in different cities. It's the way data is transported over um, broadcast standards like hardlines or satellite broadcast. So it has different parameters, but 30 frames per second, 24 frames per second, those are the standards. 24p is the standard for film, for feature films, for television shows shot on film or shot on digital cinema cameras, for TV broadcast. 24 frames per second is the image to audio relationship we're used to from the earliest days of cinematic presentation, okay, theatrical presentation. So we think of digital cinema in terms of 24 frames per second, not in terms of 30 frames per second. We think of 30 frames per second as more of a video concern, and 24p is more of a film concern. Okay, so we'll talk about 24p as our standard for pictures with audio. Okay, correlating frame shutter speed 1/48, right? Slow motion 1/96, okay, is one stop darker than 1/48 because it's half the amount of time the sensor is exposed to light as it is at 1/48. 1 over, say, 24, we don't really have the correlating shutter speed. 1/16 would be about as close as we get. One f-stop brighter because it is allowing the sensor to be exposed to light for a longer duration. 1/16 is a longer duration than 1/48. Okay. So half as much, twice as much, same relationship as ISO and f-stop, half as much, twice as much. Okay. There'll be one situation where you might have to demonstrate that sort of understanding, and it would be with the exposure worksheet that I will give you guys. It's called 1.6, and it looks like this here. This is your homework assignment. I think it's due next week on Wednesday. It's a fill in the blank exercise. It is using the relationships of, whoops, I don't have the whole document here. Let's see. Uh-oh. Um, let's see. See if I can find, assignments. Assignments. Well, I know what we can do. We'll open up the document in web courses. That will show you all 3 pages. Okay. If I open up this worksheet, come on. Web courses is slow to load today. Here. Oh, error. Ah, try it again. There we go. Okay. On the top sheet, it's kind of a fill in the blank situation. All of these solutions, you're going to use information on the second page of this document to make your calculations. So here's an ISO relationship scale. Okay. This is going in the opposite direction from the PDF document. I just want to warn you, but just understand the relationships are still the same. If you move in this direction, you're creating a less sensitivity on your sensor. If you move in this direction, higher numbers create higher sensitivity for your image sensor. And notice the relationships are still 1, 200, 400, 800, 1600, 3200. Okay. Native 800 ISO, 1600 ISO, twice as sensitive. 400 ISO, half as sensitive. Okay. Here's also a relationship, again, working in the reverse direction from the PDF. Sorry about that, folks. Here are your widest aperture openings, f1.4, f2, f2.8, 4, 5, 6, 8, 11, 16, 22, 32. Notice it gets smaller and smaller and smaller. Okay. Half as much light, half again, half again, half again, half again, right? If you start at a 5.6 and you open up 2 sizes, you're letting in twice as much again, right? 1 f-stop, 2 f-stops brighter, 1 f-stop, 2 f-stops darker, okay? Neutral density filters can work the same way. There's a numerical value here. You'll look at optical density or f-stop reduction, kind of mean the same thing. F-stop reduction, 0. ND2 or ND1/2 or ND0.3. That's a 1-stop reduction neutral density filter. It reduces the exposure by 1 f-stop. And the filter is called this. Or the switch on the camera is called 1/2. Or if this is a square cut glass filter, we call it an ND3, right? If it's a round screw on filter, photographic applications, it's called an ND2X, okay? It all means the same thing. Everything on this line correlates to 1 f-stop reduction in exposure or 50% of the total light transmission through the lens, half as much light. Okay. So you can see how the relationship works. 1, 2, 3, 4 stops. That's all we typically use in motion pictures and television. These 4 filters, ND3, 6, 9, and 1.2, this group of 4 right here. Okay. So the rest of this information on this chart is kind of, you don't need to worry about it. Okay. Shutter angles work the same way, but don't worry about that so much. The exposure worksheet, I think I removed questions about shutter angle on this sheet for you guys. I did. So you have basically a situation where you have a baseline solution on this worksheet. Okay. Baseline. What is a baseline solution? It is a hypothetical situation where I took a video clip. I don't know what it was. I don't know what the image was, but I know that these settings created a well-balanced image, not too bright, not too dark. Okay. So I had these values dialed into the camera, 24 frames per second, 1/48 shutter speed, 800 ISO, aperture of this. I had a neutral density filter of this much, all that set on the camera. right? Then I change something. Why? Because I'm like that. I'm going to change something, right? My example here is something on this line is different than it was on our baseline. If our baseline was a correct exposure and these settings were readjusted to also create a well-adjusted exposure, what changed? Well, the f-stop changed and the ISO changed. Now I have to know what the relationship is between the new ISO and the old one, and the old f-stop and the new one. If I know what those relationships are and how they compare, then it tells me how these numbers work when I change one value over another. All right. So if I were to go to shot number 2, solution number 2, and I see that this value is missing, okay, I have to set this value based on something else that changed on the same line. What changed? Well, I have the same ND filtration in the camera that I had for my baseline. So I know there's no change there. If I look at my shutter speed value, I see that 1/48 was the baseline and 1/48 is still the setting for solution 2. I see that my frame rate changed and I see that my ISO changed. Well, what's the relationship between those two values? If I know the net relationship, then I know what this value needs to be. So let me demonstrate. 24 frames is normal. 12 frames becomes my new frame rate. If 12 frames per second is now my new frame rate, did my image get brighter or darker from my original setting? What do you think? If you know the answer, just call it out. What's the relationship of 12 to 24?
12 is half of 24.
12
so
is
that
half of 24. So what do you think that would do to my exposure if I had a frame rate that was half as fast as 24? Half as fast means more light or less light is striking my image sensor?
that'd be more light because it has more time to process it.
Yeah, there's more light hitting the sensor because the frame rate is half as fast. If the frame rate is half as fast, what exposure f-stop relationship is half as much? In
2,
broadest terms, half as
right?
much. Half as much is 1 f-stop.
1 F. Okay.
It's half as much light. So if there's less light than I started with, and it's 1 f-stop, is it 1 f-stop brighter or 1 f-stop darker? In this case, 12 is twice as long as 24. So it's twice as much light hitting the sensor, which is also 1 f-stop brighter, right? Twice as much is brighter, half as much is darker. So 12 is 1 f-stop brighter, right? Now, the other thing that changed is my ISO. My ISO went from 800, my baseline of 800, to 3200. 3200, if I go to my ISO jump chart here, 800 to 3200 is how many jumps? 2 jumps. And it's going from a lower number to a higher number. So it's going to a higher sensitivity situation. It is 2 stops more sensitive. Okay, so we could call that +2, right? 800 to 3200 is +2. 24 versus 12 is +1 stop brighter. So my net or my aggregate adjustment was +2 plus +1 or +3, 3 stops brighter than my baseline. Does that make sense? If my new settings are 3 stops brighter, and I know I have to balance my image, then my aperture value, whatever this new value is, has to balance against 3 stops brighter. So it has to be what? 3 stops darker, right? If my changes over here represent 3 stops brighter, then my new aperture has to be 3 stops darker than the baseline for everything to balance back to perfect exposure. Does that make sense? Now let's go to the f-stop jump chart. If my baseline is 4 here, and I need to be 3 stops darker on my aperture to balance out with a brighter ISO and a brighter frame rate, 3 stops darker is 3 jumps which way on this chart?
Left,
To
right?
the
No,
left.
yes.
Yeah. We started at a 4. Our baseline was a 4. 1, 2, 3 jumps darker becomes, what's that?
It's F11.
F11, right? So that's the number we plug in the worksheet right here, 11. Because my ISO, my sensitivity got more sensitive. My frame rate got more sensitive. So my aperture had to become less sensitive. It had to get smaller, right? And my neutral density filter stayed the same from the baseline. Okay. So the answer here would be F11. Okay. So you figure out what changed, and then what changed has to balance with what you put in the gray box. That's how you do this worksheet. Okay. Use these charts because they're really, really helpful in making these sort of comparisons. And they'll tell you, just count the jumps. If I got to go more sensitive, I'm jumping this way. If I got to go less sensitive, I'm jumping this way. How many jumps? 1 f-stop, 2 f-stops, 3 f-stops. 1 f-stop, 1 f-stop again, right? Same with these. 1 f-stop, 2 f-stops, 3 f-stops. Brighter, darker, right? Just count the jumps. This is a little bit harder chart to interpret. There are a couple of questions where you have to choose new neutral density filters, right? So just look at this column first, f-stop reduction or percentage of transmission, okay? If you determine that your changes that have been made are half as bright as they were before, then you know that a one-stop neutral density filter will be the answer to your problem. Or maybe you start with 4 stops of neutral density and you just subtract 1 layer. 1 layer subtraction would be jumping from 1/16 to 1/8, right? And 1/8 becomes the answer to your solution, okay? If you're just changing by 1 f-stop. Okay, so this chart works a little bit differently. You're jumping up and down vertically instead of horizontally. It's still the same relationship. Okay, so I want you guys to try to tackle this worksheet. Now, page 1 has sort of fill in the values. Page 2 are your jump charts. A lot of people don't realize there's a page 3. Okay, so page 3 has 5 questions, and these questions are going to be based, your answers here are going to be based on what your answers were on page 1. Okay. So it's going to ask you things like, which of the solutions produced grainy images? Right. Well, we know because we talked a little bit about ISO, or I do in the lecture video, which you're going to want to take a look at. As you change ISOs, okay, if you go to higher ISO numbers, you create more grainy visual artifacts in your image. Okay. So if you have a solution on your worksheet that calls for a high ISO, like here or here, and the question is which solutions create grainy images, you're going to look for the solutions that have high ISOs. This one, and this one. Okay. The answer to that question would be 2, 4, and 8. Okay. All 3 of those are the correct answer. Okay. So that's how this worksheet works. Okay. Now I've put the full exposure keynote presentation or lecture in video format on your web courses. I've also put a video on there that explains again how to do this worksheet. Okay. So if you don't do this worksheet, today, if you wait a few days to do it and you kind of forget about what we talked about today, there is a recorded video that talks specifically about this worksheet and how to use the jump charts and how to fill in the answers. Okay. So there's two videos for you to look at on web courses pertaining to this section. Okay. So that is, in a nutshell, the exposure conversation for section 1.9. Okay. Now, again, I'm going to encourage you to look at the sections of web courses that are going to give you uh, information here, information in video form, a reading assignment, which will further discuss exposure for you, and then the downloadable PDFs. One of them we looked at already today. The other one is up there. It's basically a little bit broader conversation. The reading will be a broader conversation again. And hopefully between those three documents, you're going to get a very fundamental understanding of what exposure is, what it's doing, and how you can control it. It's really not that hard. It looks like math, but I really wouldn't say it's computational. It's really just understanding a very simple relationship. Is something half as much as something else or twice as much as something else? If you can basically understand that relationship, exposure calculation should not be a problem for you. You're never going to have to calculate something formulaic to derive a new value. All of that work has been done for you. All of the mathematical computations that describe the changes happening here have been done. The answers are all right here. All you need to know is 2.8 is twice as much as light as a 4. 4 is twice as much light as a 5.6. But if you start here and you open to here, you're increasing the amount of light going through the lens. And if you go from here to here, you're decreasing the amount of light passing through the lens. Right? All you need to know is the relationship between each of these numbers. Is it twice as much or half as much? Depends on which way you're rotating the ring, right? Are you opening the lens or closing the lens? And then it's count the jumps. Okay. So that's exposure for this point in your cinematography career, if you will. Let it marinate. Okay. That's the best advice I can give you on this chapter, on this kind of information. Is I think after this afternoon, let your brain rest, right? Take a look at the videos and do the reading over the next few days and do a little bit each day. If you have a camera that you can look at while you're reading about this information, I would recommend it, especially if you have access to the controls. Um, your cell phone is probably not going to be the best learning aid for section 1.9 because unless you download specific software for your phone for manual control, you don't have the control option that this section is sort of talking about. You don't have shutter speed and aperture control over your cell phone. Okay. Unless you download specific apps. Okay. So a manual video camera is going to be a better sort of visual aid, I think, at that point. You can go check out an FC1000 if you want. The equipment department has been made aware. They should have known to begin with. I don't know why they made it a problem last week for some of you to check out cameras, but I've rectified that problem so that you shouldn't have it moving forward. If you want to go and check out an FC1000 from room 157, you can do that for the remainder of summer A. for any of the assignments if it helps you in some way, or if you need it to render images. So you can do that, or some of you might already have your own cameras. If that's the case, it's a great way to understand these concepts. If you have any questions, or if you're really confused and you need extra Q&A with me, we can do a private Zoom session, or we can talk by phone, or you can send me an email with your questions and I will address them as I receive them. Okay. How do you guys feel about the conversation today? Do you have any questions about what this material is doing today? Does it kind of make sense? I'm not looking for full understanding right after the discussion. Usually it takes a while. You'll get an aha moment at some point in the near future, where things will start to make sense. It'll start to click, just kind of let it in today. Don't fight it. Just let it in, and do a little bit each day to think about this and what it means. And I'm sure that certainly between now and the end of the semester, I think you're going to get an aha moment where you're going to go, oh yeah, okay, I kind of get it now, you know. So we're looking for that. We're looking for that moment. And that's my expectation, right? Is that you just start thinking about this, because I know that a lot of you never considered this before. So it'll be the first time you're thinking about and dealing with these concepts. So we'll just take it slow, right? Take it slow and reach out to me if you're having trouble at any point understanding what this all means or what these relationships are. Okay. Anybody have any questions for me now about this? Any thoughts, reflections on this discussion that I can address now? Or are you okay with it for the moment, for the time being? Chris, Jay, Javier, any thoughts? Good. Chris is good. I got the thumbs up. I got the thumbs up. Okay. All right, then. That's what I have for you this afternoon, then. Are there any other, I got another thumbs up. Very good. Are there any other questions outside of the context of exposure that we need to talk about? Have you guys all taken the quiz? Everybody that's present here? Yeah, we've already taken it. How'd you do?
I got everything right. I took it slow and
Good.
I remembered everything, thankfully.
Wasn't that hard, right? So. Yeah, no, shouldn't be any trick questions. Good. Okay, good. All right, then. Well, then I move to adjourn this session. Do I have a second to adjourn the meeting for today? Okay, we got a thumbs up for a second. Anyone else? We good? We good to go? All right, there we go. We got the thumbs up from everybody. Good. Excellent. All right, folks. Then thanks so much for your time and attention this afternoon. Have a good afternoon. If you have any questions, reach out to me through web courses. Otherwise, I'll see you guys again on Tuesday of next week, and we'll talk about depth of field. So we're going to tie in your aperture solutions for exposure with this aspect of selective focus, depth of field. All right. So look forward to that conversation on Tuesday of next week. All right, then, if you haven't taken the quiz already, please do so by Sunday at midnight. Otherwise, have a good weekend, and I'll see you all next week on Tuesday. All right. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it. Have a good afternoon.